Do you like sleepers? Do you like compilers? Do you like players who are somehow sleepers and compilers at the same time? Not exactly sure how that works, but we're going to figure it out here on the Runs and RBI Sleepers episode of the RotoWire Fantasy Baseball Podcast. Welcome, everybody, to the Saturday edition of the RotoWire Fantasy Baseball Podcast presented by Fantrax. Erik Haltermand here with Ryan Boyer, and we are getting started on what I believe is going to be a 5-episode Saturday series here. We're going to be doing category sleepers, going 2 categories at a time, and we're starting with a bit of a tricky one, Ryan, and we'll get to a deeper discussion in a minute after we get to some of the headlines, but I just want to throw out there, as I did in the intro, Runs and RBI sleepers are a bit weird because these guys are compilers. These guys we're going to be talking about for most of the show today are kind of your boring veteran compilers, but they're also sleepers. Is that fair? I mean, did I completely screw up the topic of today's show by giving you something impossible to talk about?
Sleeping compilers. I guess they could technically fall into both of those buckets. It's also a little difficult on February 15th to project where they might bat in the lineup because we don't know for sure. That's always a tricky proposition to do at this stage, and that really affects where you're going to view these guys in terms of compiling runs, RBIs, what their lineups are going to look like, but we're going to give it our best shot.
Yeah, I think you managed to find a few names on here who are a little bit younger, who might be proper sleepers, but man, as I was putting together my names, couldn't find a lot. Maybe you'd already taken all the legitimate ones, so I've got all the boring names today, but we'll get to those soon. First, I did want to go over some of the headlines from the last few days. Let's quickly touch on Alex Bregman. I know Todd and Clay discussed his signing with the Red Sox a bit yesterday, but you and I, Ryan, are about to start our spring training job battles series. That'll be coming out next week at rotowire.com. Go to rotowire.com/try for a free look at all our articles over there. And Alex Bregman's position, I imagine, is going to have some bearing on your AL spring training job battles article. Currently, we have him listed as the Red Sox second baseman. And is that based on indications from the team? But do you believe that? How do you think the Red Sox are going to line up on opening day?
Well, I think the way they want to line up, my hunch is that they want to trade Yoshida and put Devers at the DH spot, or swap Devers and Casas back and forth at first base and put Bregman at third base. That's what I think they want to do. I thought Alex Cora's quote today was kind of interesting. He made reference to, we've got things going on that's going to affect how we are going to line up. And that was kind of my read, that they're still hoping to trade Yoshida. I don't know. Maybe I'm not reading that correctly. But, you know, as you mentioned, we kept hearing from beat writers, and I know Jeff Passan tweeted out after the Bregman deal broke that the plan is to play him at second base. That's what we had been hearing. I know Ian Brown, one of the beat writers, said after the news that he was skeptical that Bregman was actually going to play second base. So still seems to be up in the air. I think if they're not able to trade Yoshida, which Yoshida's still, they're not going to just dump him. Like, he can hit right-handed pitching. He can't do much else. Can't really hit lefties. He can't play the field, but which is why they're having a difficult time trading him, I'm sure. But they're not going to just give him away. So I guess they could just bench him and move Devers to a DH or first base, but I think it's still TBD. But obviously, Christian Campbell is a big beneficiary if Bregman does stay at third base. Potentially Vaughn Grissom. going to be interesting to follow that how that plays out in the coming weeks for sure.
Yeah, Yoshida, as you mentioned, a capable hitter, career 775 OPS across 2 seasons, but he's being paid $18 million a year for 3 more seasons. That's already 31 and is mostly a DH. So you can see why other teams aren't that excited to take him off the Red Sox hands. And that has implications, like you mentioned, on Vaughn Grissom, on David Hamilton, and then, of course, on the 2 very exciting prospects for the Red Sox, Christian Campbell and Roman Anthony. If there is a trade, then both of those guys look more like someone who has at least an outside shot at making the opening day roster. As of right now, you're probably drafting Campbell and Anthony with the expectation that you'll have to stash them, but we shall see if there is a trade coming in Boston. Certainly seems like they hope there is. Another thing that goes on this time of year, it's everybody's favorite pastime, players telling us that they're healthy. So we got a couple notable ones that I wanted to ask you about, whether or not you're moved at all. Starting with Christian Yelich, who is working his way back from back surgery. Of course, back issues have been a problem for Yelich for several years now. He did finally get a surgery in August of last year, a microdiscectomy procedure for all you back doctors out there. And the most recent note on Yelich says there's no reason to think he won't be back for opening day. That was Yelich himself saying that. So, I mean, that's what we want to hear. All it is talk, but it is what we want to hear. Are you moved at all? Are you more willing to take Yelich now that we're hearing this?
Yeah, I mean, I guess the whole reason he had surgery when he did, which why the Brewers were still obviously in playoff position, was so he would have a chance to be ready by opening day the next year. So that's kind of what we were thinking, but, coming back from a back injury, you never know. It doesn't really move him for me. He's being taken in NFBC drafts right at 110, 111. I think that's a pretty good spot. He was really good when healthy last year. And as we know, he's been playing through that back issue off and on for several years. We hope that completely puts it in the rearview mirror now after he gets this operation. We'll see how he looks in Cactus League action, but yeah, I think that's a pretty good spot to get Yelich there. I don't know if his ADP will tick up much with this news, but I think most people were figuring he had a pretty good chance of being ready by opening day.
Yeah, I think I was behind the market on Yelich up to this point, just figuring, hey, there's a pretty real chance we've gotten bad news by now. I think I'm probably willing to come up towards where he's going now that we've had this good news. But like you mentioned, it's possible his price will continue to rise, and I'll continue to not be able to get Christian Yelich. Another player who says he's going to be good to go is Felix Bautista, working his way back from Tommy John surgery. And his was a good while ago. What was it? August of 2023. So really should be no reason to fear him being ready for opening day. And that seems to be the way things have been going. We've had a couple notes now on him the last few days. The most recent one saying that Bautista is throwing at about 85% and is confident he'll be 100% by opening day. So is he a top-tier closer again? He sure was before the injury, and it looks like he's going to be healthy and pitching for a very good team. Do you buy it, or do you need to see him back on the field before you're actually willing to draft him?
It seems, at least in early drafts, that most people have been buying. He's been going pretty high. He was obviously awesome in 2023. I do worry about a guy that, is going to be relying so much on the velocity, and he already didn't have great control. What is his command going to look like coming back from Tommy John surgery? They're probably going to be hesitant to use him on back-to-back days for a while, I would guess. I think he's probably being overdrafted. But if he is ready for opening day, it could depend, I think, on how he looks this spring. If he looks dominant, his old dominant self this spring in his appearances, I think his ADP will either be static or maybe even go up a little bit more. If he looks shaky and Brandon Hyde says we might ease him into the closer role. That's going to obviously cause his ADP to drop, but will be interesting to get a look at the mountain during Grapefruit League play.
Yeah, for sure. He's fun to watch when he's at his best. A giant man throwing very, very hard. Everybody likes that. I don't know if I can take the chance for him on my fantasy team just yet until we see him back on the mound. I mean, Edwin Diaz's first year back from a long absence didn't go great last year. It wasn't a disaster. It was a different type of injury entirely, but just as one recent example of a reliever who was truly dominant and then missed a full year and then was not quite that guy. With all relievers that are going in the top 100 picks, you're turning down some really good hitters and starters to take them. And I just want a little bit more certainty than I think we're going to be able to get from Bautista. But I'm very open to the fact that I might end up being wrong there. Before we move on to the main topic, I just wanted to real quick touch on a couple players for deeper leagues who we've gotten some interesting updates on. First, Grant Holmes of Atlanta. Looks like he's going to open as the team's fifth starter. There's one spot available, or two spots available at the start of the year with Spencer Strider out. When he gets back, somebody's going to lose their job. But Grant Holmes, Ian Anderson, AJ Smith-Shawver fighting for two spots. It looks like Holmes and Anderson are probably the favorites. And Holmes, should we be paying more attention to him? I'm starting to see some low-level buzz for him. He's somebody who was a first-round pick by the Dodgers over a decade ago and didn't reach the majors until last year as a 28-year-old, but 3.56 ERA, 112 WHIP as a swingman. Is there something real here with Grant Holmes, or is he just a guy who's going to make a few starts?
Yeah, he was good last year in kind of a swingman role. Seemed like it was more out of necessity than wanting to give him some starts last year, but he did surprisingly well. It's been a while since he's been a full-time starter. I don't know. Of course, we also assumed that Reynaldo Lopez was eventually going to go to the bullpen, and he did get hurt, but he was also really good as a starter for the full year. So I don't know what to think of Holmes. He was pretty good, as I mentioned, last year. The control was pretty good. He missed some bats. What is the workload going to look like? I guess he got up to between the majors and minors and starting and relieving, got up to 140 innings or so last year. So, but that's the most he had thrown in several years. I don't know how deep he'll pitch into games, but at the very least, he's probably worth a deep league roll of the dice for sure. You're on mute, Erik.
I think it's more like 110 innings or so.
Okay.
What I was saying to myself. I didn't want anybody else to hear that. But yeah, that's enough, though, that if he gets a decent run in the rotation, if he pitches well at the start of the year and keeps a job, you could see him getting to 140, 150 this year. And yeah, there could be something there. So keep an eye on Grant Holmes, who could get a starting spot for a good team and could hold it for a while. One final minor bit of news here. I saw you tweet out just before we started the show. Ty France is maybe going to play more than expected for the Twins. It very much theoretically a deep league guy, unless he actually is going to play a lot more. Then we need to take a look at Ty France in a medium-sized mixed league. Do you think he's their starting first baseman ahead of Jose Miranda, Edward Julian? How do you think that all falls?
Yeah, Rocco Baldelli, France passed his physical today, and Baldelli was asked about him and said that he's going to play a lot. I'll just leave it at that, or something to that effect. Maybe I'm reading a little too much into that quote, but I took it as he's probably the favorite to start at first base. I'm not really interested in France at all. I'm more interested in both Miranda and Julian if they would get an opportunity. They're both Julian and Miranda are both poor defenders. I don't know how much they're potentially factoring that into their decision. And again, I might just be misreading or reading too much into the Baldelli quote, but I did think it was interesting. They gave France $1 million contract that I don't think any of it's guaranteed, they said, so they could cut him at any point during spring training if he just looks terrible. But it sounds like that's not the plan, at least going into or early on in camp anyway.
Yeah, France is someone who was somewhat interesting late in last year when he had moved to the Reds just because the park was so good and the playing time was there. But if the park and playing time are mediocre at best, then a lot less interest for Ty France. And the Twins really like to mix and match in a way that isn't necessarily great for us fantasy players. We are going to move on to the main topic of today, our run and RBI sleepers, right after this message from our friends at Fantrax. Fantrax is the most customizable fantasy platform in the industry, offering the greatest fantasy experience for your dynasty, keeper, redraft, and best ball leagues. Coming from another service, Fantrax makes it easy. Fantrax can import any of your leagues and customize if needed. Fantrax offers the most in-depth player pool in the industry, including minor league players. Do you need a customizable commissioner service for your fantasy league? Fantrax offers more customization than any other platform. Waivers, categories, scoring system, schedule. Fantrax offers custom solutions for all that and more. And it's all free. Sign up for free today and be entered to win an official MLB signed jersey from Vladimir Guerrero Jr. Simply go to fantrax.com/rotowire and sign up today. That's fantrax.com/rotowire. Fantrax, the home of fantasy sports. And welcome back to the RotoWire Fantasy Baseball Podcast. Erik Haltermand and Ryan Boyer here. And as promised, the topic of today is the beginning of our Category Sleepers series. We're starting with runs and RBI. We'll be going back and forth, giving you 10 names for each category. But first, Ryan, what are the general characteristics you're looking for in a sleeper for the runs category? If you're short on runs and it's, round 10, 12, 15, what kind of players are you looking for?
Yeah, so I touched on it a little bit earlier during the intro, but I mean, you're looking for guys that are projected to hit higher in the lineup. You're looking for guys that are on at least above average to good offenses. Those are the kind of guys that can be compilers, even if maybe the rate stats aren't sexy. But you look up at the end of the season and you've got a pretty healthy runs or RBI total if they're in the right situation. So that's kind of what I look at when I put together my list.
Yeah, I was looking at the same thing. So I'll just give you one more variable that I threw in here. Try to avoid platoon guys. These are compilers. Yep. We're trying to put up big counting stats. So I did my best to find guys that I don't think are going to sit very often at all. I mean, you can have great runs per game, but if you're only playing 4 times a week, that's just not as good as somebody who's slightly worse and is in there 6 times a week. So I believe that nearly everybody we talk about should be playing nearly every day and hitting near the front of the lineup. At least that's how it looks as of mid-February, as you've said. Bit of a tough one to do at this time of year. There will be some names who pop up with unexpected leadoff jobs late in March. But for now, Who are you going to start us off with?
I'm going to start us off with a guy who I think is probably going to hit leadoff. Masyn Winn of the Cardinals. Should mention, by the way, that we're going for guys that are currently going outside the top 150 in NFBC drafts. So that's the qualifier for our quote-unquote sleeper status. But yeah, Masyn Winn, I think he's going right around 160, so he just barely falls into that category. Hit leadoff for the final 4-ish months, I believe, for the Cardinals last year. I think he's probably going to hit leadoff again. He's frankly not a ideal leadoff hitter just because he doesn't draw a ton of walks, but I think they like him in that spot. He batted leadoff 102 games last year with the Cardinals and scored 70 runs. That's a pace of more than 100, I believe, if he played 150 games, which he did last year. Cardinals were in the bottom third in baseball and runs last year. I think they probably underachieved a little bit. They're going with a youth movement to a certain degree. They expected to do so, and more so if they were able to trade Nolan Arenado, which it doesn't look like they're going to do. We'll get to him a little more later, but I think you're hoping, based on begging on hope a little bit, that their lineup's going to take a step forward in 2025. Same with Winn himself as well. He didn't have like overwhelming batted ball data, but good young player, still very young. I think it's reasonable to think that he could take a step forward. And as we mentioned, he could be, even if he doesn't, he could be quite a good compiler if he does indeed bat leadoff.
Yeah, I'm glad you managed to start things off with at least a little bit of youth here. I was worried we'd get all boring veterans, but Winn is perfect here because, like you said, he's got the floor of being a compiler. If he's just in there every day as a guy who hits leadoff a lot of the time, that defense will keep him in there all the time and he'll be okay. And then also, what if he actually takes some step forward in the talent department? Somebody who I don't think is going to do that is my first guy here. Again, I'm on the boring veteran beat, but Luis Arraez, I think he's a boring veteran now. He doesn't actually turn 28 until early April, but we know who Luis Arraez is. He is not suddenly going to become anything other than a player who produces an excellent batting average and does just about nothing else. A 2.7% barrel rate. It was at 1.6% last year. So those 10 homers he hit 2 years ago, that's all you're going to get. But he's never hit lower than 294, and that means he's never given you an OBP lower than 346. So he should be a leadoff man. He's worse against lefties, but not unplayable. So I don't think we're at risk of a platoon here or anything. So if you're just going to play all the time, get to first base a lot, and then have some decent hitters knock you in, Luis Arraez, he's just we call him a one-dimensional player. He's a two-dimensional player. He gives you batting average and he gives you runs. 2 of the last 3 seasons, he has paired 80-something runs with 40-something RBI. So very much a lopsided player. You know whether or not you need him or not by pick 179, which is where he's going in February NFBC drafts. If you very much are short in runs and also average, there's nothing wrong with Luis Arraez. He is who he is, and that's good enough for some teams. Who else you got up next here?
Yeah, Arraez, maybe the best lineup. He's played in over a full season during his career too, so that could give him a little runs boost too. Parker Meadows managed to squeeze another younger guy on here. Really brutal start he got off to. He also was hurt for a bit, but from August on, in 47 games, hit 296, 340, 500 with 6 home runs and 5 stolen bases down the stretch. Also contributed a home run with an OPS over 800 in 7 postseason games. Was the Tigers' primary leadoff hitter versus right-handers down the stretch. And I don't think he's going to sit against lefties. He is a really good defender. I think he'll just bat in the bottom third, probably of the order against lefties. I believe in the playoffs he hit 7th against lefties most of the time. So not a platoon bat, at least it doesn't look that way going into the season. He's got a career 9.5% walk rate as well, and it's been higher than that at AA and AAA. So he draws a decent number of walks, could put up a solid OBP. And the hope is that the Tigers offense is one that could take a step forward with some younger guys stepping up, Parker Meadows himself included. And if that happens, I think he could score a decent number of runs in 2025.
All right. My next guy on the list here is Taylor Ward. I guess I'm back on the boring veterans. He's 31 years old. Taylor Ward kind of could have fit for RBI sleepers as well. I think he's mostly just a solid overall hitter who gets a little bit ignored because he plays for a bad team. I think he's a good compiler in either direction, although he's got some durability issues. Last year was the only time he appeared in more than 135 games, so you don't necessarily want your compilers to be injury prone. In ordinary circumstances, like I mentioned, it might be more of an RBI guy. He's got plus barrel rates and about league average strikeout rates. However, the Angels have already indicated that their top 3 in some order is expected to be Taylor Ward, Mike Trout, and Jorge Soler. Ward was batting leadoff down the stretch last season. So if he's one of the team's only players who should be in there every day, again, provided the health holds up, he's going to hit in front of Jorge Soler and in front of Mike Trout for at least a few weeks. Solid above average hitter who you can get around pick 180. It's really only durability questions, and I wish he played for a better team, but he's been a steady for the last 4 years. He's makes an average amount of contact and hits the ball pretty hard. This is a pretty good player. If he was playing on a better team and had a little bit more durability behind him, I think he'd be going a lot earlier as things stand, I like Taylor Ward as a stabilizer, especially if I'm short on runs. Who you got as your third run sleeper?
Got Victor Robles, who, does he qualify as a veteran now? He's somehow still only 27, which doesn't seem
borderline.
He's still somehow pretty young, but he had a bit of a resurgence with the Mariners last year. 328, 393, 467, 4 home runs, 30 stolen bases over 77 games with the Mariners after they kind of picked him up off the scrap heap after the Nationals finally gave up on him. He had a 16.8% strikeout rate down the stretch for the Mariners. He was a guy who, especially for someone whose quality of contact was never very good, struck out way too much during his time with the Nationals, but he kept that under control with the Mariners. He was Seattle's regular leadoff man during the second half. Looks like he's going to open the year in that role, both against righties and lefties. He'll have Julio Rodriguez, Cal Raleigh, and Randy Arozarena batting behind him. It's looking like it's probably not going to be a great Mariners lineup again this season. They didn't do much to address that, but that's a pretty good top 4. He could score a decent number of runs if he can carry over the momentum he developed at the end of last season. It's a little bit of a leap of faith-ish that you're going to count on Victor Robles in this, I guess, mid-career second half breakout when he had been, either injured or just not very good for several years before that. But I'm hopeful that the Mariners maybe unlocked something from him for a guy who was formerly a top prospect, and he's going late enough that I think he's worth a flyer as a 4th or 5th outfielder.
Yeah, because of course Robles could, if he played every day, single-handedly fix your speed as well. 34 steals in fewer than 300 plate appearances last year. So another one of these 2-category guys for sure. Got plenty of downside though with Robles. He might just not be a starting caliber major leaguer like was the case for most of his career, but I like him as a runs and steals sleeper. My next guy here, Jurickson Profar. Definitely a veteran. He finally broke out in his, 173rd season last year. Hit 24 homers and 10 steals while hitting 280, a 380 on base percentage. And that's actually been something that's pretty consistent for Profar throughout his career. He has walked pretty well. 4 straight years with a walk rate over 9.5%. He's at an even 10% for his career, which gives him a respectable 331 career on base percentage, despite a 244 batting average. He puts the ball in play a lot, and he takes his walks, which means he should be a good table setter for Atlanta in the early part of the season. It looks like he is one of the leading candidates to lead off until Ronald Acuna returns. And so leading off for a good team early in the year, I bet Profar is going to get a ton of runs. When he eventually moves down the order, he'll be less of an interesting runs guy. But the reason I'm still comfortable with him here is, again, this is the compiler sleepers episode. Atlanta doesn't mix and match. They just play their starters. And Jurickson Profar, he's a starter. I think he's going to be, he was at 658 plate appearances 3 years ago, 668 just last year. He's going to be right up in that range, if not higher, again this year, even if he's not one of the very best players on Atlanta. Team just doesn't use his bench. So Jurickson Profar is going to play a ton. I don't know if he'll get the 94 runs he had last year, but if he comes close to that similar on-base percentage and plays every day for a good Atlanta team, he's going to score a lot of runs. You've got another younger, slightly more interesting player up next for us?
Yeah, that's by the way, a kind of a sneaky thing to think about. You mentioned that Atlanta just plays their guys so much. You remember a couple of years ago when their lineup was so good. If you wanted any kind of piece of that lineup 2 years ago, and I think maybe they're not going to get quite back to that level, but they could be really good again. Nice bounce back year for them. When we talked about doing this category like a week or so ago for our podcast, Jung Hoo Lee was a guy who immediately kind of popped in my head as I figured he was probably going to bat leadoff for the Giants. We've since learned that now it looks like he might bat third for the Giants. I still think he's probably more of a runs guy, though. That's why I have him in the runs section here instead of RBI section. elite contact hitter before he got hurt last year, 8.2% strikeout rate. Also made pretty good quality of contact, 41.8% hard hit rate, was well above average. He consistently had double-digit walk rates during his time in the KBO. Looks like Bob Melvin is leaning towards having him batting third against righties and Lamont Wade batting leadoff, but he could still hit leadoff versus lefties. That's how we have it set up on our lineups page at rotowire.com. So he's going to bat in the top third probably against both righties and lefties. I think the jury is definitely still out on how good of a offensive player Jung Hoo Lee could be, but they're paying him a lot of money. I think they're going to give him plenty of leash. I'm not sure how great that San Francisco lineup is going to be, but he's going to be in the top third and he's going to get on base a good amount and going pretty late in drafts. So I think especially for runs purposes, he could be a sneaky addition.
Yeah, an 8% strikeout rate last year. If he can keep that up in a span of more than 37 games like he had last year before his injury, if he can keep that up, he should have an on-base percentage a lot higher than 310. He was regularly a 400 OBP guy over in Korea, definitely a table setter type. So with good health, could see him scoring plenty of runs this year, as you mentioned. My next guy is Gleyber Torres. This is another Tiger. I guess this is the first team that we've mentioned two players on. So I guess Gleyber Torres and Parker Meadows can't both lead off, but they could hit 1 and 2. Right now, we have it as Gleyber Torres as the number 3 hitter against righties and the leadoff man against lefties. But for this sleeper prediction to work, the main thing I just need is for him to play pretty much every day, and I think he's going to do that. Even though he's not coming off a great season and the Tigers didn't invest a ton in him, I think he's, the proven major leaguer in a team that's still up and coming in a lot of ways. He has had huge plate appearances numbers the last couple seasons, 672 and 675. That's led to 90 and 80 runs, even in a pretty unimpressive season last year. If Torres is going to play nearly every day and get on base fine, he's, slightly better than average in terms of putting the ball in play. There's nothing exciting about Gleyber Torres, but I think he's going to be a very solid compiler as long as the price stays inexpensive, and it is. It's $224 in the month of February. I think that's pretty good for somebody who's going to give you, a 100 WRC plus at least while playing nearly every day.
Jonathan India, my next guy, locked in as the Kansas City leadoff man, probably going to bat in front of Bobby Witt Jr., Vinny P, and Sal Perez. That's a pretty good spot to be in. India had a career high 12.6% walk rate in 2024. It's up over 10% for his career. I think the natural assumption when we found out about that trade, going from Great American Ballpark to Kauffman Stadium, is that's a big ballpark downgrade, but I think it actually is a pretty good fit for India, the type of hitter that he is. Kauffman Stadium was 4th in park factors and 2nd for right-handed batters. It's not a good home run park, but it is a good park for right-handed hitters in general. And India is not really a home run hitter. I think he could see more hits fall in. He went into last year kind of with an injury-prone-ish tag, but he stayed healthy last year. He did have cleanup surgery on his ankle over the offseason, but healthy entering camp, locked in as the Royals leadoff hitter on a team that we think may be ascending, and definitely falls into the boring veteran category. He's not going to give you a ton in regards to home runs and stolen bases, especially now he's in Kauffman. I wouldn't be surprised if he hits single digits in home runs, but I do think he's a good OBP guy, and he's going to have some pretty good hitters behind him. So going late in drafts, and I think he could potentially score 100 runs in that Kansas City lineup.
Yeah, I wish there was maybe a little bit more durability for a player who's mostly a compiler. You really want your compilers to be on the field, but talent-wise, certainly, and where he's going to play in that lineup, at least when he's not on the injured list, I think he's going to play quite a lot, and it's going to give you a whole lot of runs in those weeks. And hey, maybe he'll stay healthy this year. My final run sleeper is Yandy Diaz. He's somebody who in one of my first drafts of this offseason. I ended up with him as my first baseman, and I wasn't too happy with that. I wouldn't be planning on having him be my first baseman on many teams, but I do think if you fall into him, maybe as your first baseman or at least as a corner guy, he's going to be totally fine, particularly in the runs category. We currently have Yandy Diaz projected as the leadoff man against both lefties and righties for the Rays, who will be playing in a more hitter-friendly park this year. Don't know exactly if it's going to be hitter-friendly compared to average, but they're getting out of Tropicana Field, which was a tough place to hit. And Diaz, I wish that his plate appearance numbers maybe were a tiny bit higher to make him truly a standout compiler. He's topped out at 145 games last year. We know the Rays don't necessarily like to start you 7 days a week. But Diaz, he can still put the ball in play a ton. He takes his walks. He actually dipped to a 341 OBP last year, but he's 373 for his career. Maybe that was just the beginning of the end. He's age 33 now, so maybe I'm missing with this one, but I'm pretty sure that Yandy Diaz, while that brief blip where it looked like he might become a power hitter, I think that's over. I still think he's going to get on base a lot, and that's going to mean he's going to score a lot of runs. So I still like Yandy Diaz as a very capable compiler, and certainly in league formats where you don't need just the homers. If you're not playing in a 5x5 league or something, well, then you're probably not listening to a Category Sleepers article, but there's some other formats where Yandy Diaz is a better option as well. We will move to our RBI sleepers right after this message from Edge Boost. Have you ever had your debit card declined or had to call your bank at 3 a.m. in Vegas? Edge Boost is the first consumer-facing online bank dedicated to the gaming industry. There are numerous benefits to using Edge Boost, including $250,000 per day in debit deposits, unlimited withdrawals, cash back on sports betting, DFS, and sweeps, 100% approval for all gaming activity, financial segmentation for discretion and responsible gaming, compatible today with prediction markets, iCasino, DFS, sports betting, lottery, brick-and-mortar casinos, horse racing, and sweeps. No transaction reviews or account freezes. Visit edgeboost.bet today and use promo code ROTOPOD. That's promo code ROTOPOD. And welcome back to the start of the Category Sleepers series here on the RotoWire Fantasy Baseball Podcast. Erik Haltermand and Ryan Boyer. We have finished with runs, and now we're moving to the other compilers category, RBI. So I would ask you what you were looking for when putting together these names, but I imagine it's pretty much the same, but guys who hit third, fourth, and fifth instead of guys who hit first.
Yeah, looking for guys in the middle of lineups, preferably a good lineup. Also guys that generally stay healthy and avoid the injured list, which a couple of the guys on my list qualify, including the first guy, which I can go ahead and get to, Eugenio Suarez. It looked like, legitimately in like June of last year, the Diamondbacks could have cut him loose. He was that bad. But over the final 78 games, he was one of the best hitters in baseball. 312, 357, 617, hit 24 home runs and drove in 69 runs over his final 78 games. Finished the year with 101 RBI. In 2024, he's averaged 95 RBI over his last 6 non-COVID seasons. Diamondbacks had the top scoring offense in baseball last season. Not getting Christian Walker back, but they replaced him with Josh Naylor. Still going to be a pretty good offense. And as I mentioned before, Suarez just never gets hurt. He's always on the field. He's got a pretty good glove, so that helps him stay on the field. He's averaged 633 plate appearances per season since becoming a regular. He's the kind of guy that you just gotta ride it out with him. You got to hold your nose through the difficult stretches for Suarez because they are undoubtedly going to come. But you worry with some of those guys that eventually there's going to be a year where they just don't turn it around and they could wash out of the league. That might eventually become the case with Suarez, but I don't think that's really in danger of happening in 2025. He's going late enough for a guy who could legitimately drive in 100 runs again that I think he's a pretty solid pick.
All right, I'm going with a slightly younger third baseman who is being drafted about 10, 11, 12 picks later than Suarez, and that's Alec Bohm of the Phillies, who has had exactly 97 RBI for 2 straight seasons. Alec Bohm is probably only a slightly above average hitter. Last year's 115 WRC plus was his career high over a full season. He's at 103 for his career. He's not really a big enough power guy because he keeps it on the ground too much. Reasonable hard hit numbers, but below average barrel rates. But he puts the ball in play a lot. It was down to a 14% strikeout rate last year, and that sure is a good way to get RBIs. Hit the ball while hitting behind a bunch of really good hitters who get on base a lot, like Kyle Schwarber, Trey Turner, Bryce Harper. Do it in a good park too, and play quite a lot. 3 straight years with over 600 plate appearances. There were some brief trade rumors surrounding Bohm earlier in the season, but they never really made much sense to me because he's not good enough that a rebuilding team should want to build around Alec Bohm. And he is good enough that a team like the Phillies, who are a competitor, should still want him on their team. So the only way he was going to move elsewhere is if there was some exact match where another contender needed a third baseman and had something the Phillies had to offer. That could still happen, I guess, but I'm pretty sure that Alec Bohm is going to reprise his role as the number 4 or 5 hitter behind a bunch of really good hitters in a good lineup. That's exactly what we're looking for a runs compiler. I see that you're looking in a pretty similar place for your next guy.
Yeah, we're 2 Phillies guys battling for maybe who's going to bat cleanup at the beginning of the season. I'm going to go with Nick Castellanos as my next pick. From June on last season, 279, 333, 483, 16 home runs and 62 RBI. He was the Phillies' primary cleanup man in September and in the playoffs. As you mentioned, if he is in that cleanup spot, he's going to be behind some really good hitters, Kyle Schwarber, Trey Turner, and Bryce Harper. Very much a compiler, Nick Castellanos is. He's averaged 89 RBI over the last 4 years. He's hit the century mark in RBIs twice during that stretch. And much like Eugenio Suarez, Nick Castellanos never gets hurt. He's averaged 610 plate appearances per season since his rookie year. I mean, if he's batting 6th or 7th, the compiling is not going to compile as much. But especially if he is up in that 5 spot or 4 spot or even the 5 spot, I think he's going to be quite the compiler in that Phillies lineup.
Yeah, I'm worried about Castellanos, or at least I would be if the Phillies had a different kind of offseason. I think from a real-world perspective, he should not be playing often enough to be the compiler that he has been. He was worth 0.4 WAR last year, a total of 1.4 WAR across his 3 seasons with the Phillies. That is not an everyday player for a contender, but the Phillies have not made it seem like he's going to be anything but that. So I think you can safely draft Nick Castellanos as a RBI compiler, sleeper sort of player. Just want to say that, though, that downside, man, if they just brought anybody else in, you'd have to say, I don't know why a right-hander who has a barely above average bat and doesn't play defense is playing every day. But you got to look at the rosters as they actually stand, which is a lot of the reason why I have Andrew Vaughn as my next guy here. Can't say that I'm about to tell you Andrew Vaughn is a star hitter who's developing really well after being picked 3rd overall back in 2019. He's going in the wrong direction. His OPS the last 3 years, 750 was an okay start, but then 743 and 699 last year. But who else are the White Sox going to play? He's had 76, 80, and 70 RBIs those 3 seasons, even as he continues to get worse. And there's nobody else there for the White Sox. Well, all right, there's Bobby Dahlbeck. There's Brandon Drury. There's not a lot else. Andrew Vaughn is going to be playing all the time. And last year, even with a bad season, he was a below average hitter, a 97 WRC plus, minus 0.2 WAR. He still got you 70 RBI. He still actually finished better than his draft position in terms of fantasy earnings. I think Andrew Vaughn's going to do that again. I think he's just a compiler, but in shallow leagues, you don't want him where you're caring more about performance per game. But there's going to be a lot of games, and it's going to be acceptable enough, and there's going to be a handful of RBI there for Andrew Vaughn. Your next guy, though, might be actually somewhat interesting to talk about.
Yeah, not going to be on a good team, but Michael Toglia is a pretty interesting young hitter and definitely in a offensive-friendly environment for sure. After becoming a regular last season, had an even 800 OPS, 21 home runs, 47 RBI over 101 games, finished the season as the Rockies cleanup man. Britton Doyle, Ezekiel Tovar, Ryan McMahon, not great OBP options, especially those first two guys batting ahead of Michael Toglia, but still a cleanup man on the Rockies is not a bad spot to be in. Just absurd quality of contact with Michael Toglia last year. His hard hit rate, average exit velocity, and barrel rate were all in the 91st percentile or higher. Strikes out a whole lot. I don't know that he's going to be hitting for much of an average, although Coors is going to help him out in that regard. But switch hitter who's going to play both against righties and lefties, probably going to bat cleanup both against righties and lefties, and hits the ball awfully hard, and that's going to be enough to probably have a pretty healthy RBI total.
All right, my next guy on the list here, Rhys Hoskins. Did not have a great year last year in his first year back from a torn ACL and the first year of a 2-year deal with the Brewers. He only hit .214 with a .303 on base percentage. He's really quite a fly ball hitter, so he's always had mediocre at best batting averages. And now that his strikeout rate crept back up to a career worst 29% last year, maybe that was the beginning of the end, and maybe Rhys Hoskins doesn't play enough this year to compile. But I still think he does. I think we're going to see a slight rebound in a second year back from that major injury. I think that's going to offset some of the aging. And he got to 82 RBI and 26 homers in 131 games last year. He's still got good power, still had a strong barrel rate, just shy of 13%. He's going to hurt you in batting average, I'm afraid. And I'm aware of a downside risk here that his overall offensive performance just takes another step back. It was only a 100 WRC plus last year, which is just not good enough for a first baseman. A 32-year-old could be worse than a 31-year-old. I'm aware of that. But the price here is really quite cheap for Hoskins, $284 in NFBC drafts in the month of February. So for a corner outfielder who should play a lot and get you some RBI, he's got some flaws, but I think the positives still outweigh them for Rhys Hoskins. You've got two names left, one of whom you've already mentioned, Nolan Arenado. Let's hear it.
Yeah, kind of. It looks like he's going to stay put in St. Louis now. I think that's kind of good news and bad news for fantasy purposes. Bad news is he's going to be in a stadium that's not conducive to right-handed power. Good news is he's going to be stuck in that 3-hole or 4-hole in the Cardinals lineup. That probably might not have been the case had he gone to a team with a better offense. That means he's going to have probably Masyn Winn, either Brandon Donovan or Alec Burleson, and Wilson Contreras hitting ahead of him. Some pretty good hitters to drive in. Yes, he had a down 2024 season for sure, but averaged 100 RBI per season from 2021 to 2023. He could also get traded at midseason to a better team, a better park. Maybe that provides a boost for Nolan Arenado down the stretch. He definitely qualifies as the boring veteran at this stage of his career, but he generally stays healthy and plays every day. The defense is going to help keep him in the lineup as well. So I think he's going to put up a pretty healthy RBI total, even if he's not in a necessarily a great offense or in a great park.
Yeah, playing every day, getting the ball in the air, that will get you some RBI, as it should for Isaac Paredes, who is my second last guy on the list. I really like him after his trade to Houston, and I'm kind of wondering why he's actually still eligible for this. We're doing guys going outside the top 150. He's still around 175-ish since that trade. I think he should be going earlier than that. I think people, are they not realizing just how perfect Isaac Paredes is for the Crawford boxes in Houston? There's a trio of hitters who I've viewed as pretty similar. Your guy, Nolan Arenado, Isaac Paredes, and former Astros third baseman Alex Bregman. All of them have pretty decent power, despite not hitting the ball nearly as hard as you'd expect for someone with their kind of power. That's the most extreme in Paredes' case. He had a 6th percentile hard hit rate last year. Still managed 19 homers, which isn't huge, but he had 31 homers the year before that with pretty much the same hard hit rate as well. He gets his homers by hitting pulled fly balls just over the left field wall, and he's found a new place where the left field wall is very easy to hit homers off of. This is somebody who had 98 RBI 2 years ago while stuck in Tampa. I think if he's playing every day, hitting right now, we've got him hitting 6th, so you prefer him to hit 4th or 5th if he were really to take off in the RBI category, but still after all of the main run producers, there should be plenty of guys on base for Isaac Paredes, and he's somebody who drives them in, whether it's home runs, whether it's doubles off the Crawford boxes, whether it's sac flies. His swing is geared towards driving runners in. I think he's going to get you a lot of RBI from playing all the time, even if he is a weird player with one of the weirdest batted ball profiles out there. Do you want to give us your final RBI sleeper of the day?
Yeah, Nathaniel Lowe, kind of consistently mediocre in his career, but he posts, as the kids say. Do the kids say that? He plays every day is what we're referring to. 644 plate appearances per season over the last 4 years. Gonna bat cleanup, it looks like, probably against right-handed pitching. CJ Abrams, Jacob Cruz, and not Jacob Cruz. He's a Mizzou basketball player. What Cruz am I thinking of? I'm blanking on the first name. The young
Dylan Cruz.
Dylan Cruz. There we go. And James Wood batting in front of him. Pretty good spot to be in. And I know we have him being platooned, sitting versus lefties. I'm not so sure that that's going to be the case. He hasn't really had splits in his career, Nathaniel Lowe, and he's a really good defender at first base. I think he'll probably play every day. Probably not at bat cleanup against lefties, but I think he'll still probably be in the lineup. Nationals Park is 5th in park factors for left-handers. Again, not an exciting player, Nathaniel Lowe, but he's going to be batting cleanup at least most of the time for a fairly exciting young offense, potentially. And that is the type of player that's going to compile.
Yeah, I'm with you on the exciting young Nationals offense. I think they're a team that should be getting a little bit more love this spring. It could all fall apart, certainly, with a team that has a bunch of unproven players. But if you get enough of them taking steps forward at the same time, they could actually be making at least a little bit of noise. My final name here is Ryan McMahon. And what am I missing with Ryan McMahon? He's still going around pick 281 in February NFBC drafts. And yeah, okay, he's not a great hitter. He has never had a WRC plus above 97, but he plays in Coors. He's still going to play in Coors Field. Is there something I missed? Is the team actually going to trade him? The Rockies don't trade away their players even when they should. Absolutely, they should have dealt Ryan McMahon 5 or 6 times by now. I don't know why they're still holding on to him, but I fully believe they're going to. And Ryan McMahon plays pretty much all the time. He's played 151 to 153 games for 4 consecutive seasons. That's not 162, but it's enough to count as a compiler for our purposes. If he's going to play all the time, and if he's going to hit in the middle of the order at Coors Field, and he's going to be a fine hitter like he's been for all of his career, what am I missing here? He's going to give you 20 homers. He's going to give you at least close to 70 RBI. He's going to give you a Coors-inflated 245 batting average. He is totally fine. He's a great roster filler, and nobody seems to care about him. What's going on here? I mean, is he going to be traded? Is that all it is?
Yeah, I mean, that's you would worry that he's going to be he's a mediocre hitter at Coors Field, which Coors Field turns him into, I guess, above average for fantasy purposes, maybe, but I don't think he's going to get traded. Like you mentioned, they don't trade players when they should. So I expect Ryan McMahon is going to play the full season with the Rockies, and that alone is going to maybe you find another guy you can plug in at third base when they have a long road trip. But certainly, at least when he's at Coors, he's going to be worth rostering in fantasy leagues.
All right. Yeah, he finished as a top 200 player last year, near the back of the top 200, but I see no reason why he's not going to do that again. So that does it for our very boring compilers episode. I hope we gave you a whole bunch of names who you thought briefly about and then didn't think much more about because they're so boring. But hey, there were some young names in there you managed to throw in, particularly in the runs. I mean, the run sleepers, you can get some players who are young and have some speed. it's these RBI sleepers where really you just got to hold your nose and take that boring veteran. But in a lot of formats, you need some of these guys to round things out. We'll be back with another category sleeper episode next time. I think we'll probably do home runs and batting average, some extreme power over hit and extreme hit over power players up next. We've got 6 shows a week here on the RotoWire Fantasy Baseball Podcast presented by Fantrax.